What happened when the undercover CEO went deep inside his own university, only to find it crumbling under neglect and corruption? Welcome back, brilliant viewers. Today's story is one of shocking discoveries, injustice, and a powerful fight for change. When the CEO suspected something was wrong, he disguised himself as a maintenance worker to see the truth firsthand. What did he find? Professors ignoring students, administrators mistreating staff, and an institution on the verge of collapse. But he wasn't about to stand by and watch it fall. Stay with us to witness an incredible transformation you won't forget. Leonard Patterson had always taken pride in his private university, a prestigious institution he built from the ground up. His vision was clear, a place where students thrived academically and faculty felt empowered to shape the next generation. For years, the university flourished, earning a reputation for quality education, strong leadership, and student satisfaction. However, lately, something felt off. Complaints from students and faculty had been trickling in, delayed responses from administration, lack of faculty engagement, and declining student satisfaction. At first, Leonard dismissed them as minor issues, trusting his senior staff to handle them. After all, his department head, Dr. Howard, and administrative manager Miss Riley assured him in their quarterly reports that everything was running smoothly. But then, the complaints became impossible to ignore. Online forums, student surveys, and even faculty whispers painted a different picture, one of poor leadership, disorganized academic programs, and a lack of accountability among staff. Students reported professors who barely showed up for office hours, administrators who dismissed their concerns, and a growing sense of frustration among faculty. Worst of all, the university's enrollment rates were dropping, and alumni donations had declined, signaling a loss of trust in the institution. Leonard knew something was wrong, but the people in charge kept giving him polished excuses and vague solutions. Frustrated, he decided he needed to see the truth for himself. He realized that as the university's owner, he was too far removed from daily operations. The only way to uncover the real issues was to go undercover. But how? Unlike a CEO in a large corporation, Leonard was an academic figure, and many faculty members would recognize him. That's when he got an idea. He would disguise himself as a maintenance worker, someone invisible to both staff and students. This way he could move freely, observe interactions, and experience the university's daily struggles firsthand. With a scruffy beard, glasses, and a faded work uniform, Leonard transformed into Leo, a new addition to the university's maintenance crew. He abandoned his usual polished suit for work gloves and a mop, blending into the background as he entered the university he once built with pride. His mission was simple: find out where the system was failing, expose those responsible, and fix what was broken before it was too late. Dressed in a faded uniform, work boots, and thick-rimmed glasses, Leonard Patterson stepped onto campus as Leo, the newest member of the university's maintenance crew. The transformation was almost laughable. He had spent years walking these halls as a respected leader. Yet now, not a single person gave him a second glance. It was exactly what he needed. If he wanted the truth, he had to see the university from the ground level, through the eyes of those who were often overlooked. His first assignment was cleaning the hallways and handling minor repairs, giving him unrestricted access to faculty lounges, administrative offices, and student spaces. What he saw was worse than he had imagined. The university, once a symbol of excellence, now felt neglected and disorganized. The walls were scuffed and peeling, and classroom projectors flickered, or didn't work at all. Trash bins overflowed, and seating areas were stained and worn out, showing clear signs of neglect. Yet, the biggest shock wasn't the state of the facilities. It was the attitude of the people in charge. As Leonard mopped the floor near the student affairs office, he overheard a frustrated student asking about an issue with their tuition payment. Instead of assisting, the administrative clerk dismissed the student with a sigh, telling them to check the website before returning to her personal phone call. The student walked away, visibly upset. Leonard clenched his jaw. Was this how they treated the very students who paid thousands in tuition? His next stop was the faculty lounge, where he was assigned to fix a broken light fixture. Inside, a group of professors chatted lazily over coffee. He recognized Dr. Howard, the head of the business department, leaning back in his chair, bragging about how he barely had to teach anymore because his assistants handled everything. Students these days expect too much, he scoffed. If they can't figure things out on their own, that's their problem. The other professors chuckled, seemingly unbothered by his attitude. Leonard's stomach churned. How could an educator, someone responsible for shaping young minds, be so indifferent to his students' struggles? Despite the poor leadership, Leonard also noticed glimmers of dedication. He saw Mr. Carter, a junior lecturer, staying late to tutor struggling students even though it wasn't required. In the student center, he met Naomi, a student counselor, trying her best to assist students despite having little support from administration. It was clear that the real problem wasn't the students or faculty, it was the leadership failing them. Now, Leonard had seen enough to know that the university was broken. But he wasn't done yet. He needed to go deeper. Leonard quickly realized that the real issue wasn't just the neglected facilities or administrative indifference. It was the entire work culture. As he continued his shifts, he focused on how faculty and staff interacted with students and each other. What he saw made it painfully clear why the university's reputation had been slipping. During a routine repair in the faculty lounge, Leonard overheard a conversation that solidified his concerns. A group of professors, led by Dr. Howard, the head of the business department, were laughing about how they had found ways to cut down their student interactions to the bare minimum. "I stopped holding office hours months ago," one professor chuckled. "If they really need me, they can send an email, but I probably won't answer it." Another professor added, "I just reuse last year's lecture slides and have the TAs grade everything. Easiest paycheck of my life." Dr. Howard, sipping his coffee smugly, nodded in agreement. "These kids expect us to hold their hands. If they don't figure it out themselves, they're not cut out for college." The room filled with laughter as Leonard gripped the mop handle tightly. These weren't just a few lazy professors. This was a cultural problem that had taken root at the university's highest levels. In contrast, Leonard noticed a handful of employees who actually cared. Mr. Carter, a junior lecturer, stood out the most. Unlike his senior colleagues, he spent extra time guiding students, staying late to answer questions, and making sure they understood their coursework. One evening, Leonard saw him sitting on a bench outside the library, going over notes with a struggling student. Carter wasn't even getting paid extra for this. He simply cared. The same could be said for Ms. Naomi, the student counselor. Despite being overwhelmed with student concerns, she remained patient, listening attentively and offering advice. One afternoon, Leonard overheard her comforting a frustrated first-year student who was considering dropping out. "I know it's tough," she said gently, "but you belong here. Let's find a solution together." Leonard saw the student relax for the first time, relieved that someone was finally listening. These moments stood in stark contrast to the laziness and arrogance he had seen elsewhere. It was clear that the university wasn't beyond saving, but it needed a complete leadership overhaul. There were still good people fighting to keep the institution alive, but they were being ignored, overworked, and undervalued. Leonard was one step closer to exposing the truth, but first he needed to witness just how bad things could get. As Leonard continued working undercover, he saw firsthand how poor leadership had created a toxic environment for both students and employees. The university wasn't just suffering from lazy faculty, it was dysfunctional at every level, from administration to campus services. The neglect, the arrogance, and the blatant disregard for students' concerns all pointed to a systemic problem that had festered for far too long. One afternoon, while fixing a leaking air conditioning unit near the administration office, Leonard overheard Ms. Riley, the administrative manager, berating an employee. "I don't care if the professors need their schedules fixed," she snapped. "Tell them to deal with it. I have more important things to do." Leonard peeked inside and saw the frustrated office assistant clutching a stack of scheduling requests. The assistant hesitated before meekly nodding and walking away. Leonard clenched his jaw. This was the woman responsible for faculty support and student services, yet she treated both like they were inconveniences. Later that day, Leonard saw Naomi, the student counselor, rubbing her temples at her desk. "Another student breakdown?" he asked casually, pretending to wipe the nearby windows. She sighed. "More like 10. Students come in here crying because their professors won't respond to emails or give feedback. Some are failing simply because they can't get in touch with the people who are supposed to guide them." She shook her head. "I file reports about these issues every week. Nobody listens. Leonard nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. If the administration had simply listened to the people who cared, the university wouldn't be falling apart. Things were even worse in the maintenance department where Leonard had been working. He struck up a conversation with Jim, a janitor who had been with the university for over 20 years. Jim explained how the maintenance team was constantly short-staffed, requests for equipment repairs were ignored for months, and they were often blamed for the university's poor condition. "We report the issues," Jim muttered, shaking his head. "But Ms. Riley, she just marks them as resolved in the system without doing anything. We're just background noise to them." Leonard had seen enough. The good employees, Carter, Naomi, Jim, and others, were drowning under the weight of neglectful leadership. Meanwhile, the ones who were supposed to be in charge, Dr. Howard and Miss Riley, ignored every warning sign and refused to take responsibility. The damage was far worse than Leonard had expected, but he knew that real change only happens when the truth is exposed, and he was about to do just that. Leonard had seen enough disinterest, incompetence, and mismanagement to confirm what he suspected. The university was failing because the people in charge simply didn't care. But it wasn't until he witnessed one student's breaking point that he realized just how deeply the damage had spread. It happened in the main administrative office, where students were lined up waiting to speak to someone about missing grades, registration issues, and financial aid concerns. Leonard had been assigned to fix a flickering light in the hallway when he noticed a tense exchange unfolding between a student and Dr. Howard, the head of the business department. The student, a third year named Sophie, stood stiffly in front of Dr. Howard's desk, gripping a folder filled with papers. Her voice trembled with frustration. "Professor, I submitted my research project 6 weeks ago. I've emailed 3 times, and I still don't have a grade. Without it, I'll fail the course and lose my scholarship." Dr. Howard barely looked up from his phone. With a dismissive wave, he muttered, "Just check the portal." "I did," Sophie shot back, her voice rising. "There's no grade. I even asked your assistant, and she said she hasn't seen my submission." Dr. Howard sighed dramatically, setting his phone down like she was an inconvenience. "Then resubmit it." Sophie's hands curled into fists. "The deadline passed. I can't just resubmit it. I followed all the instructions, but if you don't process my work, I will lose my funding." Dr. Howard leaned back in his chair, utterly uninterested. "Well, that's not my problem, is it?" Leonard saw Sophie's face pale, her eyes welling with tears. She had done everything right, but her professor, a man paid to teach and mentor, couldn't be bothered to care. For a moment, the room was silent. Students in line had stopped talking, and even the administrative staff seemed uncomfortable. Sophie took a shaky breath, then slammed her folder onto his desk. "You know what? No wonder this university's going downhill. You don't care about your students. You don't even pretend to. We pay thousands in tuition, and this is what we get?" Dr. Howard scoffed, "If you don't like it, go somewhere else." Leonard had heard enough. His stomach churned with disgust, but at the same time he felt a fire light within him. This wasn't just about bad management or laziness. This was academic neglect at its worst. This was it. The moment he knew he could no longer stay silent, it was time to take action. Leonard had seen enough. The indifference, neglect, and blatant mistreatment of students and staff had pushed the university to the brink of failure. It was time for the people responsible to face the consequences. That evening, he sent out a faculty-wide announcement calling for an urgent meeting the next morning. The subject line was vague: administrative review and policy changes, but he made sure that Dr. Howard, Miss Riley, and the senior faculty were all required to attend. The next morning, dozens of faculty and staff gathered in the main lecture hall, murmuring in confusion. At the front, Dr. Howard sat slouched in his chair, scrolling through his phone, while Ms. Riley tapped her nails impatiently on the desk. "What's this about?" she muttered. "Probably another pointless policy update," Dr. Howard scoffed. Neither of them had any idea what was coming. Leonard walked in, still dressed in his maintenance worker uniform, carrying a folder thick with evidence. He took a deep breath, then removed his cap and glasses, letting his real identity sink in. Gasps filled the room. Ms. Riley's face went pale, and Dr. Howard stiffened in his seat. "Good morning, everyone," Leonard said, his voice calm but firm. "For those of you who don't recognize me, I'm Leonard Patterson, the founder and owner of this university." A stunned silence fell over the room. Leonard let it linger before continuing. "For the past 2 weeks, I've been working undercover in this institution as a maintenance worker. I've seen how this university really operates, not the polished reports, not the carefully crafted numbers, but the truth." He turned toward Dr. Howard first, holding up a printed transcript of his own words. "I sat in the faculty lounge while you bragged about avoiding office hours, ignoring student emails, and doing the bare minimum for a paycheck. I watched you dismiss a student who was on the verge of losing her scholarship because you couldn't be bothered." Dr. Howard's mouth opened, then shut, his face red with embarrassment. Then Leonard turned to Ms. Riley. "I watched you ignore faculty requests, dismiss student concerns, and let this institution crumble under your watch. You've both failed the very people who rely on you." Leonard's voice hardened. "And as of this moment, you're both fired." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Dr. Howard sputtered, "You can't be serious." But Leonard was. The toxic leadership was gone, and now it was time to rebuild. As Dr. Howard and Ms. Riley stormed out, stunned faculty and staff whispered among themselves. Some looked worried, but many, especially the overworked employees, seemed relieved. Leonard let the moment sink in before turning his attention to the people who had truly kept the university running. Not everyone had failed this institution. Some had fought to hold it together despite the leadership working against them. It was time to recognize them. He looked directly at Mr. Carter, the junior lecturer who had spent countless hours mentoring students without recognition. "Mr. Carter," Leonard said, addressing him in front of the entire room, "I've watched you stay late, guide students, and take responsibility when others wouldn't. This university needs more educators like you, ones who care. Starting today, I'm promoting you to head of student affairs." Carter's eyes widened. "Sir, he stammered, but Leonard simply smiled. "You've earned it," he said firmly, "and we're increasing funding for student support programs, so you'll finally have the resources you need." Next, Leonard turned to Ms. Naomi, the student counselor who had been tirelessly helping students despite her lack of authority and resources. "Ms. Naomi," he continued, "you've been a voice for students when no one else would listen. From now on, you'll oversee student services directly under the university board. If something isn't working, you'll have the power to fix it." Naomi's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I just want students to feel like they belong here." Leonard nodded, then addressed the entire room. "Effective immediately, we're making major changes to this university. We're increasing faculty support, investing in classroom maintenance, and setting new policies to ensure every student gets the education they're paying for. No more ignored emails, no more missing grades, and no more unchecked power." A wave of applause spread through the hall, growing louder as employees realized that for the first time in years, things were actually going to change. Leonard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The damage had been deep, but the right people were finally in place to rebuild. The university had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he knew it was headed in the right direction. 2 weeks later, the transformation was undeniable. Walking through the university halls, Leonard could feel the difference in the atmosphere. Where there had once been frustration, neglect, and low morale, there was now energy, purpose, and optimism. Students filled the study areas, actually engaging with their professors, and faculty members no longer treated their jobs as mere obligations. Instead, they were actively involved, mentoring students and holding proper office hours. The changes were finally taking effect. Leonard took a seat in the student lounge, watching quietly as Ms. Naomi led a small support session, helping students plan their coursework for the semester. Nearby, he spotted Mr. Carter speaking with a group of students, explaining an assignment in detail. Unlike before, there was no frustration, no confusion, just a professor who cared and students who wanted to learn. The university was finally becoming the institution he had envisioned years ago. The administrative office, once a place where requests were ignored and students were brushed off, had been completely restructured. New leadership ensured that emails were answered, concerns were addressed, and faculty members had the resources they needed to teach effectively. With Dr. Howard and Ms. Riley gone, those who had suffered under their neglect were finally free to do their jobs without fear of being dismissed or overruled. The physical transformation of the campus was just as noticeable. The classrooms had been cleaned, broken projectors had been replaced, and long overdue maintenance issues had been addressed. Leonard had personally ensured that the janitorial and maintenance teams received the funding and support they had been denied for years. The days of faculty and students working in a deteriorating environment were over. As the lunchtime rush died down, Mr. Carter approached Leonard with a grateful smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "for believing in us, for fixing this place, instead of giving up on it." Leonard smiled. "You all deserved better, and this is just the beginning." The university still had challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, Leonard knew it was moving forward. The right people were in charge, the right policies were in place, and most importantly, the culture of neglect had been replaced with one of accountability and care. This was no longer just a business to him. It was a second chance for the institution he had built, and he wouldn't let it fall apart again. The story of Leonard Patterson's undercover journey highlights an important lesson. Leadership isn't just about authority. It's about accountability, presence, and genuine care for the people you serve. When leaders become too distant from daily operations, they risk losing sight of the real issues affecting their organizations. Leonard's experience showed that blindly trusting reports and senior staff without direct engagement can allow corruption, laziness, and neglect to fester. Another key takeaway is that a toxic culture at the top trickles down, affecting everyone beneath it. Dr. Howard and Ms. Riley's indifference had created a ripple effect, disempowering faculty, frustrating students, and driving the university toward failure. However, the story also proves that not all institutions are beyond saving. When the right people are given authority and support, positive change is possible. Lastly, the story reinforces the value of recognizing and rewarding those who truly care. Employees like Mr. Carter and Ms. Naomi were fighting against the system, and with proper leadership, they were able to transform the university into a place of true learning and support. In the end, organizations don't thrive because of titles. They thrive because of the people who genuinely care about making a difference.